Okay, so welcome. Just to say that we're recording this event and it'll be available to all of you that have signed up for the event afterwards. Um, However, we're not admitting AI agents to the event, just but you can see the video afterwards. Very, very happy to welcome you all here today and to present to you Professor Stuart Selber of Penn State University, who's going to talk on the topic of digital literacy, AI, and the liberal arts from taxonomies to heuristics for teaching and learning. My name's Jeff Gilbert. I'm a professor here at the American University of Paris, and along with Jeff Gima, who's librarian at AUP and director of the AMICAL consortium and co-organizer of this event, we're coordinating AUP's response to the presence of generative AI and related technologies within education. And that means we're working with colleagues across the university, and that involves rethinking many aspects of how we frame and conduct teaching and learning, particularly how we imagine digital literacy as part of the learning process. We've been really excited by Stuart Selber's work in this area. His framing of questions around writing and technology, particularly, are very deeply grounded in humanistic ideas, technical knowledge, and social science methods. And one thing that for us has set him apart is it always shows real respect for the accumulated wisdom of people who teach. I won't name his publications or his awards, there are far too many, but we found particularly useful his book from nearly 20 years ago called Multiliteracies for a Digital Age. And we're impatiently waiting for the publication of Gen AI in college writing programs, which is coming out very soon with Chicago University Press. We've asked Stuart to direct this talk to the American University of Paris in particular. That's a small Anglophone liberal arts college in Paris. But we're delighted that colleagues from within the AMICAL consortium are here too, as well as guests from outside the network. We're very sure that the questions that apply to us are going to be useful to you too. And we're also just in passing very grateful to Alex Armstrong of AMICAL for technical support for this event. We hope that you won't mind if we take the very first questions from AUP colleagues and then open the floor after that to more widely to the rest of you here. If you want to leave your questions in the chat, we'll be sure to come to you in good time. So I'm very proud indeed to welcome Stuart Selber and to hand the floor over to him. If you can virtually welcome him, that'd be delightful.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to share my screen here. And it's good to see everyone. And thank you, especially to Jeff and Jeff for the invitation to speak with you today. The questions that animate this gathering about digital literacy, AI, and the liberal arts are not only timely, they are principled. They ask us to move beyond reacting to a new technology and to think more carefully about what teaching and learning mean in a moment of rapid change. What strikes me about AUP's approach, as outlined in the AI charter Jeff shared with me, is that you have not begun with questions of prohibition or permission. You have not rushed to enforcement mechanisms, compliance language, or technical restrictions. Instead, you've paused to ask a more difficult and important question. What does it mean to teach and learn well, here and now, in your institutional context, amid ongoing developments in digital literacy, including the emergence of generative AI? That is the right question, and the pause that enabled it is productive. In fact, pausing is a key aspect of critical literacy and has always been an effective strategy. Pausing is useful precisely because it creates space for judgment rather than reaction. At the institutional level, a pause allows values, mission, and local educational goals to come back into view, resisting the pressure to let external technological forces dictate curricular decisions. For teachers, pausing offers the opportunity to make pedagogical assumptions explicit, to ask what an assignment is really designed to teach, how learning becomes visible, and where automation or delegation supports or undermines that work. And for students, pausing interrupts the experience of mixed messages and constant acceleration, inviting them to understand technology not as something to be adopted reflexively or avoided anxiously, but as something to be engaged with purposefully and with accountability. In each case, pausing does not signal hesitation or resistance. It creates the conditions for deliberate action. We're living through a period of sustained institutional pressure. Generative AI systems have developed at extraordinary speed, largely driven by commercial incentives, platform economies, and military research, rather than by pedagogical values. Faculty are being asked, often reactively, to redesign assignments, assessment practices, and instructional goals that may have been stable for many years. Meanwhile, our students are navigating contradictory messages. They are told, on the one hand, that AI will define their future workplaces, and that not knowing how to use it will disadvantage them. On the other hand, they are warned that using it may constitute misconduct or a violation of academic integrity, or worse, that it may undermine their learning, weaken critical thinking, and ultimately dumb them down. In moments like this, it is understandable that institutions look for stability, as they did with earlier writing technologies. Spell checkers accused of weakening spelling, Wikipedia framed as a threat to research, or digital writing tools treated as shortcuts rather than literacies. In Wikipedia's early years, many instructors simply ruled it out altogether, discouraging or outright banning its use, rather than teaching students how to read it critically. Rules promise clarity and control. They offer the feeling that a rapidly shifting situation has been stabilized. But rules also have limitations, especially in volatile moments. Rules can age badly. Any policy crafted around a specific tool, platform, or affordance is likely to become obsolete quickly. Also, rules tend to mischaracterize educational questions as compliance problems. They transform matters of judgment, learning, and responsibility into issues of detection and enforcement. In short, rules regulate behavior, but they do not cultivate judgment. Rules do matter, of course, serving certain important institutional purposes. And the same is true of taxonomies, which attempt to sort technology uses into discrete categories, such as acceptable use, unauthorized, or prohibited. Like rules, taxonomies promise clarity and manageability. For example, by distinguishing between AI technologies that assist versus those that automate. But taxonomies share many of the same problems. They can age quickly, oversimplify complex practices, and shift attention away from judgment and learning toward classification and compliance. As with rules, taxonomies should not be the main thing we bring to our thinking about digital literacy. So let's pivot from rules and taxonomies to heuristic frameworks, or what I'll simply call frameworks. Frameworks operate differently. They provide shared language, values, and orientations that help people reason together when new situations arise. Frameworks support deliberation rather than shutting it down. They help institutions think rather than merely react. In periods of change, frameworks age more gracefully than rules because they are not tied to specific technologies. They reflect purposes, practices, values, and forms of responsibility. The point of my talk today is that digital literacy, understood broadly and developmentally, offers precisely this kind of framework. More specifically, I want to suggest that a multiliteracies approach can help translate your AI charter from a statement of principles into a living pedagogical resource. One reason conversations about digital literacy often feel frustrating is that the term itself refuses to settle into a single, stable definition. For some, digital literacy names technical competence, knowing how to operate software programs, platforms, and devices. For others, it emphasizes critique, understanding how media systems, algorithms, and interfaces shape knowledge, power, and participation. Still others associate digital literacy with creativity, design, multilingual communication, collaboration, or ethical engagement. These differences are often treated as obstacles, as if we simply haven't agreed on the correct definition yet. But I want to propose a different interpretation. These differences are not failures of consensus. They are evidence that digital literacy is inherently situated and historical. What it means to be digitally literate depends on discipline, institutional mission, cultural context, linguistic diversity, historical moment, and more. In this view, disagreement is not a problem to be solved, but a signal that digital literacy functions as a relational practice, continually reshaped by the specific conditions in which it is taught and used. My field, writing studies, has lived with this reality for decades. Each major technological shift has affected what counts as writing, who controls it, and how learning becomes visible. The move from handwriting to print altered authorship and originality. Typewriters changed revision practices and writing tempo. Word processors made editing faster, but less visible. Networked writing reshaped audience and participation. Learning management systems redistributed attention and surveillance. Crucially, none of these technologies simply added capacity. They redistributed labor, attention, responsibility, and authority. New affordances emerged, but new problems did as well. AI belongs to this longer history of educational technology. It feels uniquely disruptive, not because it is entirely unprecedented, but because it accelerates delegation. Activities that were once slow, effortful, and visibly human, such as drafting, summarizing, and synthesizing, can now be mimicked quickly and at scale. I'm behind a slide. Sorry about that. Seen this way, AI is less a rupture than an acceleration. It forces educators to surface pedagogical assumptions that have long remained implicit. What does it mean for writing to function as evidence of learning? When is effort educationally meaningful? What kinds of automation are compatible with intellectual responsibility? These questions were always present on some level. AI resurfaces and intensifies them. This capacity to make the familiar strange may be what is most productive about any new technology. It allows us to revisit practices we no longer question, practices that have become naturalized and taken for granted in our classrooms. Once literacy is framed as developmental and contingent, the question moves from whether someone is literate and to how literacy actually operates in the world. At that point, reasoning emerges as a central feature of literate activity. I want to suggest that literacy is best understood not as a fixed status one either possesses or lacks, but as an ongoing process of making meaning with symbols, texts, and technologies in particular contexts. To describe someone as literate is less a declaration of completion than a shorthand for a set of practices that are always developing, revising, and sometimes failing. People do not simply acquire literacy once and for all. Rather, they continually negotiate new genres, media, audiences, and purposes. In this way, literacy names a dynamic activity, a verb more than a noun, shaped by experience and changing social conditions. Central to this process is reasoning. Literacy involves far more than decoding words or producing grammatically correct sentences. It requires interpreting situations, weighing evidence, anticipating consequences, and making judgments about what to say, how to say it, and why. Whether reading a scholarly article, composing an email, analyzing data, or navigating a digital interface, literate action depends on discernment and problem solving. Readers and writers draw on prior knowledge, recognize patterns, question assumptions, and adapt strategies as circumstances demand. Literacy, then, is inseparable from thinking. It is a way of reasoning through the world using representational tools which are always biased in one fashion or another. No tool, no human artifact is without a point of view. Literacy is also situated and relational. It takes shape within communities, institutions, and activity systems that value certain forms of knowledge and expression over others. What counts as effective or appropriate literacy practice in one context may not in another, which means literacy always involves learning how to read situations as much as texts. Because contexts change, literate individuals are continually learning new conventions, new technologies, and new ways of participating. From this perspective, literacy is never finished. It is an ongoing process of inquiry, adaptation, and judgment through which individuals make sense of their worlds and act within them. This is a perspective we need to cultivate with each other and with our students. If literacy is an ongoing, situated process of reasoning with symbols and tools, then it cannot exist as a singular, universal capacity. Different contexts demand different forms of sense-making, different habits of interpretation, and different criteria for effectiveness. The literacy practices required to read a legal contract, program a computer, analyze a scientific data set, participate in a community forum, or navigate social media, each draw on distinct conventions, values, and modes of reasoning. Treating literacy as singular risks flattening these differences and privileging one dominant set of practices while rendering others invisible or deficient. By contrast, thinking in terms of literacies, plural, recognizes that people routinely move among multiple systems of meaning, each with its own expectations for evidence, credibility, audience awareness, and action. Understanding literacy as plural also foregrounds learning as continual and uneven rather than linear or complete. To reiterate, individuals do not simply become literate and remain so across all situations. They develop particular literacies in response to specific social, institutional, and technological demands. New tools and genres do not merely add to an existing store of skills. They reconfigure what reasoning looks like and what participation requires. As contexts shift, familiar strategies may fail, requiring adaptation, judgment, and sometimes unlearning. Calling these practices literacies emphasizes that they are historically contingent, socially organized, and always in motion. It encourages educators to ask not whether students are literate, but which literacies they are developing, which they are being asked to perform, and which remain marginalized or undervalued. This view of literacy as plural, contingent, and continually remade raises a practical challenge. How can educators and institutions talk about literacy in ways that are both precise and actionable, especially amid rapidly changing digital environments? If literacies differ across contexts, technologies, and purposes, then we need an approach that allows us to conceptualize those differences without reducing them to a checklist of skills. To address this complexity, I now turn to a multiliteracies framework that offers a way to describe not whether students are literate, but how different dimensions of literacy operate in digital contexts. I developed this framework many years ago, as Jeff noted, over 20 years ago, but have adapted it here to address AI and to reflect changes in my own thinking. I will move through it relatively quickly, since the full approach appears in my book, Multiliteracies for a Digital Age, and that is available online through the AUP library. Yep. Hold on. All right. My multiliteracies framework distinguishes among three types of literacies: functional, critical, and rhetorical. These are not stages students pass through, nor are they competing priorities. They are lenses, ways of understanding what kinds of activities and perspectives are at issue in different situations. This table conceptualizes the framework, assigning a metaphor, subject position, and objective to each type of literacy. You can use this framework to design individual assignments, entire courses, and even a curriculum. Like a fractal, the framework scales. My basic view is that we should help students develop different kinds of digital literacies and become skilled at moving among them in strategic ways. My three literacy categories are not meant to be fixed or even exhaustive. They are suggestive and work best as complements. In other words, this is not a taxonomy that asks you to choose theory over practice or vice versa, or to focus on rigid categories in an abstract way. Instead, the framework represents a way of thinking that helps students ask what kinds of perspectives and practices are needed in a given situation. Being able to draw on the right literacies at the right times and in the right places is a key quality of people prepared for the 21st century, both in school and on the job. What the heuristic really tries to do is map the literacy landscape students should be able to navigate, The functional category relies on a tool metaphor and emphasizes effective use. The critical category relies on an artifactual metaphor and emphasizes informed critique. And the rhetorical category relies on a media metaphor and emphasizes reflective praxis. The goal is to help students recognize how each metaphor filters experience and become fluent in shifting among the metaphors as appropriate. The metaphors connect to three subject positions students can occupy: users of technologies, questioners of technologies, and producers of technologies. Again, the point is not to privilege one role over the others. It is to help students understand that different situations invite different stances. Each literacy category also has a distinct purpose. The purpose of functional literacy is to help students learn to use digital technologies effectively, though that effectiveness has a particular meaning in my framework. Functional literacy is often dismissed as merely instrumental, yet without it, students lack meaningful access to academic, civic, and professional participation. Critical literacy focuses on informed questioning, asking students to examine who designs technologies, what assumptions shape them, and whose interests they serve. Critical literacy resists the idea that technologies are neutral tools and instead treats them as artifacts of culture embedded in power relations. Rhetorical literacy focuses on producing digital texts that circulate on the internet and on intranets, where much contemporary work happens. In my original formulation in the book, rhetorical literacy emphasized the interfaces writers need to design for readers who operate texts as much as they read them. Think about an e-portfolio presented on the web and how a student has to design not only the content, but also navigation, visual arrangement, and patterns of use that shape how readers make meaning. Today, an equally pressing question for rhetorical literacy is the where of AI, specifically where students are allowed to engage AI within an educational workflow. For many instructors and students, this is the key struggle right now, not simply whether AI should be used, but where its use might be appropriate, visible, permitted, or restricted. The question of where shifts attention from tools and artifacts to contexts, asking at what stages, for what purposes, and under what conditions AI may be involved. Is AI acceptable for brainstorming, but not drafting? For revision, but not evaluation? For private composing spaces, but not public circulation? Framed this way, rhetorical literacy treats AI use as a situated production decision shaped by audiences, genres, teachers, institutions, and ethical expectations, rather than as an all or nothing choice. I want to take another moment with the framework, since each type of literacy brings with it a set of learning outcomes. There are 5 learning outcomes for functional literacy. A functionally literate student uses digital environments effectively in achieving their educational goals. They understand the social conventions that help determine the use of digital environments. They make use of the specialized discourses associated with digital environments. They effectively manage their digital world, and they resolve impasses in digital environments confidently and strategically. For example, a functionally literate student might customize a writing or research platform, adjusting notification settings enabling accessibility features, organizing folders or tabs, and configuring citation or revision tools, so the software actively supports a specific learning goal, such as managing a long research project or tracking revisions across drafts. My approach to critical literacy has 4 learning outcomes. A critically literate student scrutinizes the dominant perspectives that shape digital design cultures and their artifacts. They see use contexts, really our classrooms in many ways, as an inseparable aspect of digital environments that help to contextualize and constitute those environments. They understand that institutional forces shape the use of digital environments, and they scrutinize representations of digital environments in the public imagination. For example, a critically literate student might examine how AUP's IT policies around data storage, software licensing, or AI access shape what kinds of work are possible in a course, recognizing that decisions about approved platforms, default privacy settings, or surveillance features are not neutral technical arrangements, but institutional choices that influence student and teacher behavior, authorship, and accountability. And finally, my approach to rhetorical literacy, adjusted to focus on the where of technology, has 4 learning outcomes. A rhetorically literate student produces academic work with an awareness of where particular digital tools belong within a workflow process. They make intentional choices about where and when to use, limit, or exclude specific technologies to meet the goals of an assignment. They align stages of production, such as research, brainstorming, and drafting, with differing expectations about assistance, originality, and authorship. And they understand that placing technology at particular moments in a workflow shapes how academic work is interpreted, evaluated, and credited. For example, a rhetorically literate student might determine that AI assistance is appropriate during early stages of an assignment, such as brainstorming concepts, testing outlines, or generating counterarguments, but exclude it during drafting or final revision, recognizing that different points in the production process carry different expectations about evidence of learning, intellectual labor, and authorship. Collectively, these outcomes help make learning visible again in environments where intellectual labor can easily be obscured or delegated. They foreground not just what students produce, but how and why particular technologies are brought into or kept out of academic work. Okay, let me close by returning to the question that animates both your AI charter and my own remarks today. How can a university move from principled reflection to sustained practice without collapsing judgment into compliance or pedagogy into policing? This is not merely a practical question. It is an institutional one. It asks how values are enacted, how responsibility is distributed, and how learning remains visible and meaningful in conditions of technological acceleration. What I want to suggest is that a multiliteracies framework offers a way to bridge that gap, not by supplying rules or best practices, but by providing a shared orientation that can operate across institutional structures and classroom contexts alike. In this sense, multiliteracies does not function as an instructional technique or a policy instrument. It functions as a connective framework, linking mission to pedagogy, governance to classroom judgment, and institutional values to everyday decisions about teaching and learning. So let me talk about the institutional level and then the pedagogical level. At the institutional level, your AI charter already does something important and increasingly rare. It resists technological determinism. Rather than beginning with what AI can do or how it should be regulated, it begins with what AUP is, a small, multicultural, liberal arts institution defined by human interaction, deliberation, and disciplinary difference. That framing matters because it positions AI not as a force to be managed, but as a set of pressures that must be interpreted through local educational purposes. A multiliteracies framework complements this orientation by shifting the institutional question from what should AI be allowed to do to what kinds of literacy practices does AUP want to cultivate and under what conditions. When institutions frame technology in this way, they create space for judgment to be exercised at multiple levels rather than centralized in a single policy or office. Consider the Charter's emphasis on grounding technology use and locally determined educational goals. This could be read as a call for faculty autonomy, which it certainly is, but it is also a call for institutional restraint, a refusal to standardize pedagogical responses to AI across disciplines whose practices of inquiry, evidence, and authorship differ substantially. A multiliteracies framework gives that restraint teeth by recognizing functional, critical, and rhetorical literacies as distinct but interdependent. The institution can support faculty and programs in articulating which literacies matter most in particular curricular contexts without imposing a universal model of AI literacy that flattens disciplinary difference. In one department, functional literacy with AI tools may be essential. In another, critical interrogation of algorithmic authority may take precedence. In a third, rhetorical decisions about when and where AI enters a workflow may be central. None of these priorities contradict the Charter. They enact it. This approach also reshapes how we think about transparency and oversight. Too often, transparency is operationalized as disclosure requirements. Who used what tool, when, and how. But multiliteracies encourages a different model of transparency, one grounded in purpose rather than surveillance. Instead of asking faculty or students simply to declare AI use, institutions can encourage explanation. Why was a tool used at this stage of work? What function did it serve? What was excluded and why? This is a qualitatively different form of accountability. It aligns with the Charter's emphasis on human oversight, not as technical monitoring, but as shared reasoning. Oversight becomes a matter of sustaining conversations across faculty committees, teaching and learning centers, and student governance about how technologies are shaping academic work and which literacy practices should be foregrounded as conditions evolve. Crucially, this orientation also supports academic integrity as a value rather than an enforcement regime. If integrity is understood as a disposition toward responsible participation in academic practices, then institutions must design environments in which those practices and the judgments they require remain legible. Multiliteracies helps keep that legibility intact by resisting invisible automation and encouraging explicit reflection on where technologies belong within institutional workflows. Integrity is not protected by catching misconduct. It is cultivated by clarifying purposes. Okay, let me jump to the classroom level. At that level, these same principles operate, but at a finer grain. Here, the challenge is not institutional coherence, but pedagogical design, how to construct assignments, activities, and assessment practices that invite students into literate judgment rather than strategic evasion. Generative AI intensifies a long-standing pedagogical problem. Much academic work has relied on proxies for learning. That is, products that stand in for thinking rather than revealing it. When tasks are primarily evaluative rather than exploratory, students are encouraged to optimize outputs, especially when optimization tools are readily available. The question then is not how to prevent AI use, but how to redesign learning experiences so that delegation becomes visible, discussable, and contestable. A multiliteracies framework offers instructors a way to do this without turning every assignment into a referendum on AI. By explicitly framing activities in terms of which literacies are at stake, instructors can help students understand what kind of work is being asked of them and why certain forms of technological assistance are appropriate or not at particular moments. For example, an instructor might frame an early research assignment as primarily functional, emphasizing effective use of digital tools to locate, organize, and manage sources. AI-assisted summaries could be discussed openly here, not as a shortcut, but as a tool whose effectiveness and limitations must be evaluated. Later in the course, a critical analysis might foreground critical literacy, asking students to examine how AI systems shape knowledge production in their field, whose voices are amplified, and how authority is constructed. In this context, unreflective reliance on AI would directly undermine the learning goal. Instructors can use rhetorical literacy to clarify the where of AI within a workflow. Instead of issuing blanket permissions or prohibitions, faculty can design assignments that specify stages of production and ask students to justify their choices about tool use at each stage. Reflection becomes part of the work rather than an add-on, making judgment visible and accessible. Notice what this approach does not do. It does not require instructors to become AI experts. It does not ask students to master every emerging tool. And it does not assume that consistency across courses is either possible or even desirable. What it does require is pedagogical intentionality, a willingness to articulate purposes, to explain decisions, and to treat literacy as something students are learning to do, not as something they either possess or lack. This is where the Charter's emphasis on critical digital literacy across the institution finds its most concrete expression. Informed judgment is not achieved by warning students about dangers in the abstract. It is achieved by embedding reasoning into ordinary academic work, by making the conditions of tool use part of what students learn to navigate. When students are asked not only to produce work, but to account for how that work came into being, they encounter technology as a site of responsibility rather than convenience. So what I am describing is not a solution to the challenges AI poses for higher education. Rather, it is a way of living with those challenges without surrendering pedagogical values to technological momentum. Frameworks, unlike rules, do not promise stability. They promise capacity, the capacity to reason together when conditions change. Your AI charter already embodies this orientation. It resists premature closure. It foregrounds human interaction, institutional context, and shared responsibility. A multiliteracies framework can help carry that work forward by offering a common language for thinking across levels of the institution, from governance to curriculum to classroom practice, without erasing difference or foreclosing debate. If I have a final point, this is what I would emphasize. The task before us is not to decide once and for all what AI means for education. It is to design educational environments in which judgment remains central, learning remains visible, and responsibility remains human. Literacies, plural, situated, and always in motion, are how we do that work. Thank you. Stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Stuart. That was extraordinarily efficient and elegant, and like practically extremely helpful for us. We'd like to open to questions now, and as we said before, perhaps would like to begin, if possible, with people from AUP who may wish just to raise their hands. Do I see any? Maybe as people are formulating their questions, I can um start with something. Maybe, and I'm afraid I tend, well, whatever, I'll start. The 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 thrill of this talk is for me that it resituates a defense of the idea of education in a context that's very well defined. Um, it also asks that the values of education be maintained by educational institutions at a time when other values and other power structures are being very heavily advertised and are becoming quite attractive to our students. Um, I think maybe the idea of the liberal arts is less immediately legible to our students than it was in the past. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about because I think one of the reasons why there are people who wish to refuse engagement with the digital is a kind of political grouping, like the force of wanting to stand for one set of values that they feel are under threat, rather than
Mhm.
confidently exploring the force of those values in the world. I wonder, like, what your feeling is about the name of the liberal arts and the ways in which we engage the question of defense of those values without rigidifying them, if that makes sense as a question.
It does make sense. And I'll just start by saying that um, when I have the opportunity to talk to people outside of the liberal arts, about a liberal arts perspective, and of course there are many liberal arts perspectives, they are quite pleased with it and really had no idea, in fact, that how useful our thinking can be. So I think what I've learned is I have to get into the room with people.
Mhm.
And universities can make that hard because we have silos, and at least I can't speak for your school per se. Maybe it may operate a bit differently since it's smaller, but there's a divide between people who take care of IT and make IT decisions and faculty. And so we're almost never in the same room. And so on my campus, there are people making decisions about our AI infrastructure, our technology infrastructure, who never taught a day in their lives. They're not teachers. It's not a criticism. It's just the reality. They're IT professionals. They could be working at a bank. They just happen to be working in a university. So we have to get in the game in a lot of different ways. And one way is getting into the right rooms and sharing a liberal arts perspective. So this is for the non-liberal arts people, and I have found them to be quite open-minded and well-intentioned, even as I completely disagree with how they may be thinking about things. Um, within the liberal arts, we do have people who are trying to hold back the flood, um, and it's entirely understandable. In writing studies, my field, there's actually a refusal movement. And the refusal movement is based on the concern, very specific concern, that the big tech companies are profiting tremendously at the expense of our students and are not doing enough to think about what their products mean for education. And that is the basis of that movement, refusal movement. But I don't think that's our best. Refusing is our best approach because university is not going to wait for us one way or another. It's moving, and we need to be at the table. So I think our best chance of making sure the liberal arts has a future
Mhm.
is to get in the ball game, and I do think that people not in the liberal arts can see the problems. They can see the risks and worries. They don't necessarily have the frameworks for thinking about it. Um, so this is the history of automation, by the way. There will be winners and losers. There always is,
Mhm.
right? So that this is no different than that. And we'll have to see how things shake out. But the liberal arts will be a loser if we are on the sideline. Uh, that I feel fairly confident about. And we may have to remake some of our thinking, but I don't think we're going to have to. But I'm rambling a little bit. But take this prompt engineering, right? The what you do to ask a robot for output. There's zero engineering
Mhm.
in prompting. Ask an engineer if they see any engineering. There's no engineering. That's an appropriation of the liberal arts.
Mhm.
That is instructional writing. You are instructing a large language model, and when you call it uh, prompt engineering, you move it into that context and you wrap it in that way of thinking. And there are finally some frameworks for prompting coming out of the liberal arts that ask the kind of questions we ask about writing, actually. Because if you're going to get good output, you have to you have to teach you have to teach the robot about audience and purpose and context and genre. Very much a dialogue. Kind of hate some of the language because it's not a person. It's a language machine that operates on language. That's all it is. That mimics. But my point is there's zero engineering. Why is that being treated as an engineering topic? Because we let it get away from us, or maybe we didn't have a choice, but we should get it back. You know.
I see a question from Raphael.
Yes, and I'm on a train, so if it's possible for you to read it from the chat, it would be much appreciated. Sorry for that.
Of course, not at all. Thank you for attending from the train. So Raphael asked, he says, you made a very convincing point on the need for framework and not rules. Appreciated your development on places and the where and the when of tool use. Raphael's question is, does multiliteracy require a space also where no tool is available? Just book and human brain. Should a space where no tool is available exist within a university?
So this is just a fabulous question, Raphael, because uh, it gets to something I didn't address, which what is a tool? So we don't tend to think about books so much as tools, but printing press was, you know, revolutionary, literally when it came to literacy, moved literacy into the masses and away from political leaders and the church. Uh, 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 we don't think about paper and pencils and pens as tools. They become naturalized and taken for granted. Chalkboards, we don't tend to think about those as tools anymore because they become naturalized. Um, and I think they're how we think has always been mediated. Walter Ong famously called language a technology. So I think on the one hand, it's very helpful to understand that we are in this liminal moment with AI where it has not become naturalized, and we can still ask hard questions about it. And we may not be able to do that in 5 or 10 years because it's becoming integrated, and it will no longer be separate, something we can wall off. It will be much more integrated into educational technology. But I think you're asking a good point. Um, uh, there are, for example, faculty who are returning to conversation with their students, and that conversation happening not at the end of an assignment as reflection, but happening like not summative, but more formative. Student has ideas. They're required to come to your office. They're required to talk through those ideas with you. They're required to talk through those ideas with their students. Those conversations can be captured as a way of making thinking visible early. So, I mean, to the extent that you think something like that involves technology, that's probably pretty low tech. Kind of so I don't have any bright ideas here. We have people returning to blue books, and blue books, if you know what those were when we were handwriting tests. You would go into a lecture hall and teachers would pass out a little small notebook, and students would write their exam in that small note handwrite, and then students would collect those. And there are teachers who have gone back to that, and I'm not sure that works very well because students are word processing. Students aren't handwriting in that way anymore. So, and that's out of literacy they have learned. So we ask them in a high stakes moment to abandon word processing and their devices to handwrite, and they just don't have that literacy practice. So I'm not sure that that's very fair. We have that problem at the graduate level where we have graduate students do like timed writing for their comprehensive exam, like 3 hours or 4 hours of timed writing, but nowhere else do we ask them to do timed writing in that way. They write in their own spaces with their books and all of that. So um, I'm not sure I have a very good answer for you. I think it's a great question, and I think it's very tricky. Raphael. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I see Jorge.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Stuart. Thanks for your presentation. In this context, I would like to ask, and what is, according to you, the role of a librarian in this whole process of a teaching librarian? Where, historically we've been dealing with information literacy, we're dealing with digital literacy as well. And I wanted to ask you if, in your opinion, AI is the AI literacy is also one of those, because we've been, teaching critical thinking. And to me, that's the framework that is behind this. And so, do you see AI literacy as part of the role of the librarian, or do you see it outside of that realm?
Thank you, Jorge. Here at Penn State, we're a large research university. We have 45,000 undergraduate students on the main campus, and we have adopted a literacy framework from a librarian, Leo Lowe. Yeah, and that's what we're using for the entire campus. So we're actually coming at it from the perspective of the libraries, or at least Leo Lowe's perspective. And I marvel honestly at our librarians, not just because I'm friendly with them, but they understood early on that once everything moved online, right, and people were no longer going to the physical library in the same way at all, at least here, they had to define a new role for themselves. And so you walk into our library and it's full of group spaces and workspaces, and it's just not the library, an idea of the library that I grew up with, but it's highly successful. And I think the library is a model for other parts of campus to remake themselves. There are people who are wondering if we even need to teach writing anymore because of AI. Or in my context, what do we need an English department for, anymore? And I'm sure there are people who are wondering, why do we even need librarians anymore in some way? Of course, we need librarians more than ever because we have so much information to manage and organize and understand. And you will need to know more about writing, not less, to work well with AI. You will need more domain expertise about the craft of writing, not less. And the question becomes, what does the future of a writing teacher look like? I'm not sure I have all those answers right now, but our approach has been really library centric. I don't actually agree with that full law. I don't know if you're familiar with that piece that got a lot of attention on his part. It's called I got it here because it's always never too far from me. AI Literacy for All, a Universal Framework, Leo Lowe. And because to me, there's no, as you could tell from my talk, there's no universal framework. One framework for literacy, which is, I think, the path my institution is going down, and what I'm trying to kind of discourage. There is no one framework for all. And if you start thinking in that way, you have to reduce it. You have to reduce out all of the complexity to kind of make it work for all. So I think that's kind of counterproductive. And then the other thing, and I don't know how far this has gone in your world, but Bloom's taxonomy from the 50s and 60s, it gets so much mileage that this is how people learn. And I look at this thing and I say, well, maybe they learn that way. I don't know. I don't think people start like declaratively, like at the bottom, like reading about something, and then practice is like in the middle. And in my experience with AI, people just start using it and trying things. And that's kind of trial and error. And they use technology. I mean, most technology users know 5% of a software program. That's fine. they know what they need. It's this kind of a procedural relationship with technology. And if they don't know how to do something, then they'll learn that thing. And I think the way people are learning about AI and digital technologies is not always formally through a classroom or through a library. To me, does not really map onto that model of learning, even if I see the value in, I think it helps with scaffolding. I can see how it's helpful. But I think we actually don't have a very good sense of how people learn technology. And probably that's because we like to talk about students, but we really don't like to follow them around and study students. And that's a big hole in our learning, is really understanding. We really need some empirical studies, qualitative studies, following students in their concrete uses of AI in our institutional settings. I just don't think we know. We think we know a lot, but we haven't really studied it. And that's my sense.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I
thank you, Jorge. Yeah.
I see a question from Anna Paulina Lee.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. You provide such a clear methodology for working with AI tools and the definitions. It's very clarifying and incredibly useful. I have more of a question, since you've been working with this for so long, to reflect on how you think AI is changing the way that we're thinking. You're showing how it's thinking the way that we're changing the way that we're writing. And you just mentioned that students today, I do see a big generation gap between the Gen AI and the rest of us. And it really does seem like the way they think is going to be very different than the way we think for those people who grow up with AI. So I was just wondering what your reflections are on this as you've been working through these topics. Just, it's changing the way that writing happens and just even thought, itself.
It is. And, the brain is wetware. The brain evolves in response to our activities. It's dynamic. So the brain evolved in response to the printing press, and people think they're good at long form reading or patient reading naturally, but they're not good at that naturally. That's conventional. They grew up reading books, and they grew up doing long form patient reading, and the brain evolved to do long form patient reading. That's what's threatening uh, to people who grew up with that kind of literacy. And then, of course, we all value what we grew up with and our literacy histories. People who grew up without that, who aren't being asked to read it in the same way or read differently, right? Their brains are evolving differently. Our students probably do more writing than we ever did, but a lot of it's through text messaging. And you can look at text messaging as a degraded form of literacy if you want to, and it's certainly not academic literacy per se, but they're doing a lot of writing and practicing writing a lot, and their brains are evolving for that. And so, and then we saw it with like the web, like people uh, started more routinely skimming and scanning text and clicking links. And then we started structuring, redesigning text for those kinds of, people wouldn't call those, maybe not call those reading practices, but I would. So reading on the web is different than reading long form books. I do think we have to be careful about making like comments that depend too much on the medium, because people will say, well, people don't read web pages patiently. And I would say, well, if you have a friend who was diagnosed with a horrible disease and you go on a website to read about it, you're going to be motivated to read patiently and carefully. So there are plenty of contexts where people are still doing that kind of reading, but I think the practices you're seeing now are in part a response to managing so much information. And I don't know where the brain is heading. And your sense is probably better than mine as you watch students and work with students. And a lot of that is not on their part very conscious. It's just kind of happening. And that's actually something we can study. Again, that we're not kind of studying. So it's very easy to say students today are, they're not literate or they can't read or they're impatient or whatever. But 53% of adults in my country, in America, read below the 6th grade level. That was before AI. That's a startling, explains a lot too, by the way. That's an absolutely startling statistic. So, and these switches aren't thrown overnight. So we'll see how K through 12 takes this up, and that is a battlefield right now. And then when they get to our universities, that literacy history is going to be baked in, and we're going to see how we feel about it. But you're absolutely right that the brain is moving. And I try to keep an open mind about it. And when students show me things they're doing, I try not to say, kids today don't know what they're doing. And I try to say, teach me something about what's going on here, because it's usually more complex than it looks. Not always, but it's usually more complex than it works. And they're probably going to have to help us understand what's going on. We're so early, right? Like ChatGPT, came into public view in November of 2022, right? Like we were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years with the printing press. And then computers got into the classroom in some people say the 70s, but it was really the 80s, right? The public web was 92. So we're 25 years into the public web, in the history of literacy technology, this doesn't even register. It's almost to the right of the decimal. It's so tiny. So it's hard to measure it and understand it. It's just, as I said in my talk, it's just so dramatic because of the way it accelerates delegation. It accelerates delegation in a way no other technology has before. And it's why the law can't keep up. The law hardly ever keeps up. But the law is based in print technology, and it doesn't there is not law for a lot of the things people are in court for. So and the law itself is going to take a long time to kind of catch up. And law is different, as you know. In the UK, intellectual property law says you can copyright something from a non-human. And in the United States, copyright law is you can't copyright something unless they're human. So we don't have some coherent legal apparatus. So that means, well, many companies are global, but that means probably companies based in here will base something in Europe and then use a robot over there to create copyright protected information. Yeah, I mean, it's all a patchwork, and quite tricky.
I see a hand raised from Miriam Sackley. Miriam, did you wish to ask a question?
Yes, I want to ask a practical question, actually. Thank you very much for the taxonomy and for this beautiful presentation. But I have a moral, sort of, question that I'm developing, this textbook, for my students. I have a draft of it, but I would like to use, I'm using, for instance, ChatGPTs, chatbots to create, for instance, questions that my students could answer, and the chatbot would reply to them. And I have developed 3 of them, one on the critical reader, the other one is the citizen. asking a politician, and the other one, it has to do with collaboration and so on, and it is based on a 7th century text that we are reading that actually empowers, or its main target is to civilize people, to make them more politically aware of their rights, and the relationship between a politician, a leader, and the people that he is serving. So, but however, I mean, my problem is that how much AI can I use in my book? I have developed these questions, but still I found the questions suggested by Claude, particularly Claude, is really good with Arabic. I don't know why, but it is much better than GPT. So
Yeah.
what do you suggest? How do you see
So,
something?
right. So it's a great question, and it's relevant. And the answer to that question is going to be different in different situations. So the first question you're going to have to ask yourself is who's going to hold the copyright to the book? Is that going to be you or a publisher? Because if
Yeah.
a publisher is going to hold the copyright to the book, they're going to have their own rules about how AI can be used. That's going to be to their comfort level. According to AI companies, you hold the copyright to your prompts, and you hold the copyright to the output. And they want you to hold that because they want you to use it. And every output is, in theory, original, and you own it. You own the copyright. So it only becomes a legal question if the copyright holder, like if you want to publish an article in a journal, every journal may have a different stance on what authors are allowed to do with copyright. Some journals may not care at all and leave it to you and just ask for a disclosure statement. So that question is answered differently across the board. And I think in a university context, question of copyright doesn't really matter for our courses so much. Universities try to claim copyright over faculty work sometimes, and in online classes where they're, at least at my university, if I develop an online course, I get released for that, but it's work for hire. The university owns the copyright and owns the course, and they sell it to students as credits. And I don't get like a royalty in that. They can decide how much AI they're comfortable with me using in a Penn State course. So, yeah, you have to think through this is the literacy I'm talking about, that there is no one answer to the question of AI and copyright. We want our students to be able to think through every situation and ask themselves, is copyright even an issue here? May not be an issue. If it is an issue, then what do I have to think through if it is an issue? If it's not, so in our courses, copyright's not really an issue because students own the copyright to the work they produced for us. I'm assuming that's true in not just in America. It's their work. Just because they own the copyright to something like AI output doesn't mean they can automatically submit it to us for course credit. Copyright doesn't afford that. We make our own. We don't allow students here anyway to reuse work a second time and get credit for it again. So we have our own rules about how you can use your own work. So that's going with a textbook publisher. That's who you need clarity from. If you're doing it yourself, you can have your own stance, your own ethical stance, your own instructional stance. And then you even have to decide, are you going to disclose it? Transparency, or are you going to not? I promise you, there are all kinds of people not disclosing. Faculty are probably worse than students at not disclosing.
What I noticed.
Yeah.
They want to use it, but they don't want to let students use it.
Exactly. We're bad. I know. We're terrible. It's true. You're absolutely right. Yeah.
One of Professor Miriam Sackley's colleagues wanted you to know that Professor Sackley is representing the Al Akwain University in Ifran in Morocco, which is the only American liberal arts style university in Morocco. Just so you know something about your
Yeah.
So, folks, I think we're coming towards the end of the time that we assigned to this. And perhaps I'll just thank Stuart very much on all of our behalfs. The talk was intensely clarifying and extremely elegant, and I'm very grateful to him indeed. Can we virtually thank him for the talk and send him on his way? Thank you so much, Stuart.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Stuart. That was great.
Yeah. Thank you.